The face of California's workforce differs in fundamental ways from previous generations. The Great Recession only accelerated these changes. Are different state policies needed to better support business while advancing the economic security of workers? We'll ask. Luke Reidenbach, policy analyst with the California Budget and Policy Center, a nonpartisan organization that focuses on evaluating the impact of public policies on low and middle-income Californians. We'll also hear from Tom Scott, executive director of the National Federation of Independent Business, California, an association representing small and independent businesses. Employment conditions, post-recession, same as it ever was?
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world, and by Kaiser Permanente, Thrive, from the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute. It's the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
So what is the post-recession jobs report? Have we finally made it all the way back, or do we still have a ways to go? Our guest is Luke Reidenbach, a policy analyst with the California Budget and Policy Center. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So has California regained the number of jobs lost as a result of the Great Recession?
Yeah, it has. We are now 700,000 jobs more in California than we were before the Great Recession began. Since the recovery started in early 2010, the state has added more than 2 million jobs. And what's even better is that the state is growing at a pace that is much higher than the national average. So California's labor market is actually doing quite well. That said, workers are still facing a number of challenges throughout the state, especially in some regions, like here in the Central Valley. Unemployment remains very high in some regions. In fact, 1 in 10 workers are out of work.
That's historically been a problem in the Valley,
Right.
a high unemployment. But let me ask you this. Normally when you come out of a recession, they get out of a recession typically, I think the average you said is 31 months in your report. It wasn't that way this time. This time it was like 60, two-thirds more, like 50 months, I think you said, in your report. So why did it take so much longer to get out of the recession this time than in previous recessions?
We like to describe the current jobs recovery as typical job growth following a one-of-a-kind economic downturn. The rate of job growth, the pace of recovery is actually pretty similar to what we've seen in previous economic recoveries. The problem is that it's following an absolutely devastating economic recession. Right? We lost somewhere around 1.4 million jobs in just a few years. So it's really not about the pace of recovery, it's about what we're following.
Well, one of the things also was interesting in your report that I read was the public sector and the impact of the public sector on bringing those jobs back.
Yeah.
A lot of jobs were cut in the public sector as local communities had to cut back because they didn't have the tax revenues.
And a lot of those jobs haven't returned. The local government sector really has struggled to find its footing, and some analysts have actually observed that maybe those jobs are gone for good, that maybe the local government sector cut to the bone and then is figuring out efficiencies in other areas. But the local government sector has usually been a source of job growth and has actually sort of helped offset devastating losses, and that just hasn't happened this time.
Yeah, what about the long-term unemployed? Has their situation gotten better or worse?
Their situation's gotten better. And in fact, in this recession, one of the most defining problems was this issue of long-term unemployment. Right? Millions of people were unemployed, and a significant share of those were unemployed for long periods of time. We're talking about 6 months, a year. And at one point, there was over 1 million people in California who were unemployed for 6 months or longer. And that's actually down to around 400,000. So we've seen a lot of progress. The question for us is actually what's happened to those people, right? The longer that you are unemployed, the more likely you are to drop out of the labor force entirely, go into early retirement. You're not even counted in the numbers, right? You kind of disappear. And even for those who do get jobs, they often take jobs that pay less than their earlier jobs. And so there really is a lot of questions about what's happened to those workers and how they're doing now. And that, to me, is a more interesting question to answer, and we're hoping to find answers to that soon.
It's what's kind of devastating is particularly you see the older workers, lose a job, and how difficult it is to get back into the labor market after you've lost a high-paying job as an executive or something. Well, let's talk about the wages of California workers. How were California workers doing before the Great Recession?
Not that great if it comes to wages. Even before the recession started, low and mid-wage workers were enduring pretty much decades of stagnating wages. And what that means is that the wages they were earning were not keeping up with the overall cost of living.
So their purchasing power basically is flat.
Yeah, it's flat. And
anybody doing well?
High wage earners, right? And so this is, there's actually been sort of this widening wage inequality where high wage earners have seen their wages outpace the cost of living, so the purchasing power of their wages are going up. But for low and mid-wage workers, they're either stagnating or eroding. And this has happened even before the recession began, and it actually worsened during the recession.
What about low-income households? You said in your report that they actually increased 12.3% from 1979 to 2007. How does that happen?
So that is one of the more interesting takeaways from these trends is that annual earnings are going up, but hourly earnings are going down. And one of the reasons for that is that people are simply working longer. Right, that much of this increase in annual earnings is simply because people making up for the declining purchasing power of their wages. They're just working more. And while their standard of living may have gone up because their annual income is going up, that's undermined by the fact that they have to put in a lot more hours to get there.
Okay, and so what did the Great Recession do to the earnings then of low and middle income workers?
So during the recession, kind of get out of econ land for a minute, right? And just, during the recession, what happens is that there's so many workers that are unemployed. Everybody's competing for the same jobs, and employers don't really feel compelled to lift wages, right? Because they can get the same employees for essentially less. And what happens is as the cost of living goes up, the purchasing power of the wages that people have who are employed erode. And that happened to not just low and mid-wage workers, but high-wage workers as well. Okay. But since the recovery started, only really high-wage workers have seen their wages go up.
Okay, well, thanks for that post-recession jobs report.
Yeah.
Up next, has the California workforce changed in the aftermath of the Great Recession? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. So what does the California workforce look like? We're talking to Luke Reidenbach, a policy analyst with the California Budget and Policy Center. So can you describe the face of the California workforce? How is it changing?
Yeah, so over the last 2 decades, or 3 decades that we looked at, California's workforce has become increasingly diverse. In 1984, 1 in 3 workers were workers of color. Now that's far more than half of California workers are workers of color, and a good third are Latino. And so what we were looking at is how that workforce has changed and whether workers of color face any specific challenges.
Yeah, do they?
Yeah, so workers of color tend to have much more volatile experiences in the labor market. They're more likely to see their wages decline or erode, and they're more likely to face unemployment, both in good times and bad. And so from our perspective, if you want to increase employment outcomes for California workers as a whole, you actually have to focus on the specific challenges that workers of color face in the labor market.
Is that because of educational levels or something like that? What's driving that?
Some of it is education levels, training, it's access to good jobs or the types of jobs that workers of color or in communities of color can get. There are other factors as well. There is sort of known biases in hiring that kind of happen at all levels. You do have sort of mass incarceration that actually has disproportionately affected communities of color, and that has an impact on their employment prospects once somebody leaves the system. So all these factors are working together, and there are many more. I mean, it's an extraordinarily overwhelming and complicated problem, right? But the fact is that we have to do something about the challenges that workers of color face.
Yeah, what about women? Their role in the workforce is obviously expanding. What are some of the unique market challenges that women face?
So women face a number of problems in the workforce, and this is even after making significant gains over the last 50 years. It's hard to actually overstate the economic importance of women entering the workforce. They've been one of the biggest drivers of the increase in household incomes. But at the same time, they're often paid less for similar work, and this is something that recent legislation signed by Governor Brown is going to try to address. They're underrepresented in management and CEO positions, and also the rise of women in the workforce has sort of corresponded with this other challenge of families having a hard time balancing the needs of work and family, right? The share of households where all parents are working has gone up to more than half, close to 60% for families with children. Right? So now families are having to figure out how to afford childcare, how to balance some very practical, work-life considerations.
Any parent would know that.
Yeah, and this is not something that's really brought up in sort of the field of economics, but it really actually ends up being an economic issue because you have to think about how to make it easier for families to work,
Right.
and how to be full-time workers.
And that's child care policies and things of that nature, leave policies.
Exactly.
Let me transition to, we talked earlier about education levels.
Yeah.
How is California doing in terms of educational levels relative to other states?
So the share of California workers who have at least a bachelor's degree has been steadily ticking up. This is a good sign. This is a sign of progress. We have a better educated workforce than ever before. We have lost ground to other states. Other states have sort of outpaced California in education gains, and we still fare fairly well compared to the rest of the nation, but we are losing our competitive advantage.
And that, possibly, tuition rates have gone up in the last few years. That could play a role, but California's system is kind of unique in that if you look at around the country, more Californians use public higher education than in most other states. So they'll go to a community college or a CSU or a UC. So, when those rates change, those tuition rates change, that has a big impact on Californians. Let me go to education and getting a good job. My parents always stressed, get an education, you'll have a good life because you'll get a great job. Were they right? Is education the key to economic prosperity?
It is essential. It's not a guarantee of economic prosperity, but it's a key sort of ingredient for economic mobility. Right? College-educated workers get paid far more than other workers who have sort of similar qualifications, right? The same levels of experience, similar demographics, same age. If you're college-educated, you're earning up to 70% more than the other worker.
And they call it the college wage premium.
Yeah, and it's flattened over the past decade, but it's still very high. And if you look at these issues of wage erosion and wage growth, all these problems that are affecting low and mid-wage workers, that's actually not happening over the long term for college-educated workers.
So get a college degree. It's probably a good idea.
Yeah.
What about the flip side of that equation? The growing share of low-wage workers in California. How common is low-wage work in our state?
About a quarter of workers in California are what we consider low-wage workers, and that is slightly above what it was 35 years ago. So low-wage work is actually a little bit more common than it used to be, and this is partly because we've let the minimum wage erode over time. It's less powerful than it used to be. It could be because of the type of industries, the rise of sort of the service sector and retail jobs. And so despite all these years of economic growth, we still have sort of this enduring low-wage work sector.
And we were talking earlier that the wage levels of low-wage workers has pretty much been flat over time. It's one of the problems maybe here, the power to negotiate higher wage increases.
Exactly, and the decline of unionization is playing a role here, where workers just across the board, low and mid-wage workers, have less bargaining power, even during times that are good. And this recovery is pretty good. We have an above-average economic recovery. At the same time, low and mid-wage workers aren't seeing robust gains in their wages.
Okay. More work, not really more wages.
Exactly.
I guess a good summary.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for the overview of demographics of the California workforce. So our state policies needed to help California workers. We'll get an employee perspective next. This is the Maddy Report. After the Great Depression, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt used government action to help build the middle class. 75 years later, do we need something similar to help California's struggling middle class? Our guest is Luke Reidenbach with the California Budget and Policy Center. One of the things you argue in terms of state policy, you're saying it's not kept up with the needs of the middle class, and one thing you talk about is the necessary increase in the minimum wage, that it hasn't stayed with the rate of inflation. There are some, though, on the business side that would say that if you raise the minimum wage, you're only going to encourage employers to hire fewer workers and or automate. How do you answer that?
So this is a widely cited concern about raising the minimum wage. This is often brought up, but recent history has proven that these fears are mostly unfounded. So that the combined evidence that we have on the impact of the minimum wage has shown little to no effect on the employment levels of low-wage workers. But that said, we should take these considerations seriously. I don't want to dismiss the concerns of the businesses, and so that's why I think when you implement minimum wage increases, you have to do it carefully. You spread it out over a long period of time. You give them time to adjust, and so this isn't sort of one dramatic increase. I think you could be smart about minimum wage increases in a way that make it better for the business community.
Okay, so what about this thing called an earned income tax credit? You're hearing a lot about that now. Can you explain what it is and why you think it would help California workers and the state economy?
Sure. So California just passed what's called a state earned income tax credit. And this is based off of the federal earned income tax credit of the same name. And what it is it's essentially a tax credit for low-income working families. You have to be employed, but you also have low incomes. And you get a tax credit worth, for the California version, up to, or an average around $500 to $800. And you get that in the form of a refund, or it reduces your tax liability if you have any tax liability. And the federal credit has actually been a huge success. Right? It gives families a really critical economic boost and a one-time check. It allows them to pay down debt, pay their bills, invest or save.
Right.
It's
incentive to work because you have more money.
You have to work in order to get it.
And these people are going to, they're not going to typically save the money, they're going to spend it.
Some save, actually.
Well, I would think that would heat up the economy, though.
Yes.
Because they're going to go out there and they're going to buy they're putting off buying that refrigerator or something.
Right. Yeah, and 80% of these checks are actually spent locally. So. And so we're really excited about the earned income tax credit. Taxpayers will be able to claim it for the first time this tax year.
You know, the flip side of that coin is it's going to cost the state. They're going to lose some revenue if they give a tax credit. Where does the money come from to pay for this?
So the state earned income tax credit is projected to cost around $300 million. Our general fund budget is around $113 billion. And I think it's mostly...
Say that again. It's $300 million cost on a budget of...
$113 billion.
$113 billion.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is...
So put it in perspective.
Put it in perspective. It's going to help a lot of people. And I think it really is about priorities, right? I mean, this is sort of a drop in the bucket, but it also has the potential to huge impact on these low-income families.
You know, you've been working in and around state government and analyzing it too long. When you say $300 million, and everybody does.
No,
it's a drop in the bucket.
As soon as I said that, I was like, oh, well, it's not a drop in the bucket. But in terms
but
of
it is
what
compared
we're
with
spending, you know, we spend $10 billion in the state correction system, and so it really is about priorities.
Yeah, 1/30 of that amount.
Yeah.
So another thing that you're talking about is education and skill levels. Everybody seems to say, listen, that's great because workers then can earn more money. But the devil, of course, is in the details. The question is, for example, with higher education, who's going to pay for it? Should the student be paying for it, or should the state be paying more of that cost? What about skills improvement? Should that be the worker, or should that be the employer? I mean, how do you answer those questions?
So this is a good question. I think on the issue of higher education, traditionally California has prioritized higher education so the public pays for it, right? It's an investment in California's workforce. So therefore, students pay a smaller share. They pay some of it, but they don't bear the brunt of the cost. Right. That has actually shifted, right? And tuition fees have more than tripled over the last 2 decades. And so I think it's less about who should pay for what. I think it's a public investment, right? And because these things will, this will benefit our economy in the future. You
know, one of the things you talked about earlier was the overrepresentation of people of color in the criminal justice system and the impact that has on their ability to get a job because there are hiring restrictions and impediments. What kinds of restrictions and impediments are you concerned about, and what would you like to see removed?
So there are a range of restrictions and challenges for people who are formerly incarcerated. One, they've seen their skills and education erode over time. So, one is just making them competitive in the workforce, right? And that includes, training for specific occupations or going back to school. They also actually face a number of restrictions on what kinds of jobs they can take. And some of these make sense, but some of them are a little goofy. And I think we need to sort of rethink about, limiting the kinds of jobs that those who are in the system
take a closer examination of those things. One thing I want to just follow up on, we've only got about 20 seconds left in the segment, but I want to ask you about the role of unions in raising the wages of lower middle class workers. The state can't deal with private sector workers, they can only deal with public sector workers in that regard. Federal law takes care of private sector workers. So one thing the state could do is, for example, allow in-home healthcare workers to unionize. That would probably result in higher wages, but also result in higher costs. Right. So isn't that just a wash? Is that really getting us ahead?
I don't think it's a wash because some of these public employees are doing the kinds of jobs that I think we as Californians value highly, right? I mean, we have the same approach to teachers, right? There's that same debate of teachers of how much teachers should get paid, but at the end of the day, we value the work that they do, and we think that as long as unions are a way to increase that value of work for them, then it's worth doing.
Okay, well, I want to thank you for that perspective on state workforce policies. Up next, a business perspective on what needs to be done or not done by the state to help the middle class. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Unlike FDR, Ronald Reagan argued that trickle-down or supply-side economics would raise all boats and that government action would hurt, not help, the middle class. So what's the business perspective? Our guest is Tom Scott, Executive Director of the National Federation of Independent Business for California. So let's talk about minimum wage. It's usually touted as a way to help the working poor, get them out of poverty. Proponents who want to raise it say inflation has eroded the earning power of the minimum wage. And they say that in any event, if you increase the minimum wage, research shows that it really doesn't have a big effect on employment. So what are your thoughts on raising the minimum wage?
Well, I mean, look, there's as much research on the other side that says that, it has a huge impact, that it does not increase job growth. Small businesses have fixed budgets, whether it's workers' comp, whether it's mortgages, all the capital costs, liquidity, inventory. Just the minimum wage increase that we've seen, recently was about a 25% hit to small businesses. If we were to increase that to $13, let's say, I mean, that would be nearly a 63% increase on those fixed costs for a small business. I mean, I've seen some stats saying potentially a $13,000 hit per employee. So, I mean, there are definitely costs associated for the small business owner. I mean, if you have 10 employees, you're looking at potentially $130,000 that you're having to come up with.
And the question becomes, can you give those costs to the customer? Are they willing to pay for that additional expense? And some industries or some services and products, they don't. They won't, some they will, I guess, so it kind of depends on the industry. What about earned income tax credit? That's another thing that people talk about, kind of helping the working poor. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, earned income tax credit, definitely, I mean, I know the statistics show that it raises people out of poverty. I think 3.3% of Californians have raised out of it with it. Should it be expanded? I know there's a huge percent that do the federal. I think 70% do the federal. There was a bill in the legislature this year, AB 43. NFIB didn't support it. We don't have a huge history in that area. I think if you were going to expand it, it should include small businesses.
Sure. Well, let me kind of switch gears a little bit and maybe talk about something you might agree with, maybe on the other side, and that is having a skilled workforce. It seems to benefit employers to have a skilled workforce and increasing need for college graduates, et cetera. So what's the state's role here? I mean, should they be putting more money into higher education, vocational training, or both?
Well, I mean, look, 52 to 55% of the state budget goes to education. I mean, that is a huge sum of money.
And that includes K through 12
K
as
through
well
12,
as higher education.
Plus higher. I mean, I think there needs to maybe be more emphasis on the vocational training, whether it's construction, mechanical, all of those various jobs, good paying jobs, but this sort of obsession with the 4-year degree, I don't know if it's paying off. It's paying off with large debt for students and not necessarily equaling jobs, but maybe more emphasis on the vocational training area.
There seems to be a big need there, and a lot of that training is actually done at the community college level. So emphasizing maybe community college education.
No, definitely.
Another thing that was talked about in an earlier segment was ex-prisoners that served their time and now they're out, but now they're having a hard time getting a job. Should we be doing things to make sure that people, once they pay their debts to society, can become productive members of society?
Look, I have been on a Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors. I serve on the Sheriff's Advisory Committee here in Sacramento County. I also chair the Folsom Prison Advisory Committee. I mean, this is one of these issues where, when I toured Rio Consumnes Correctional Facility, I mean, the vast majority of the people that are there because they didn't have a job and they had to commit a crime. They have a son or a child, a wife. Look, we have to get these people back working. The business community has some responsibility in that. I don't think that means that there's a movement in this state to eliminate businesses' ability to check criminal backgrounds. I don't think that's the answer. But I definitely think, look, I mean, people have to be put back into work. I mean, they will not commit the crime again. So I think there is some fine line here. I've said repeatedly to the business community, we have a responsibility here.
Finding that right balance. That's always the question, isn't it?
It's huge.
Well, I want to thank Tom Scott with the NFIB for joining us, as well as Luke Reidenbach with the California Budget and Policy Office. If you want to stay current on state and local politics, you can follow the Maddy Institute by either looking at our website page or going on Twitter and following us there, or logging onto our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.